Welcome back to Northwest City Politics in the Know with Juanita. We're glad that you're joining us for our show again this week. We are always glad for people like you who are interested in the issues that are happening in our city. So we're glad that you're with us each week. And if you haven't watched us before, each week we'll have someone on from one of the 9 cities in CCX's viewing area to teach us and keep us abreast of what's happening or what will be happening in the future. And then we'll encourage you to be in contact with your mayors and city council issues if any of these are ones that are important to you. And from time to time, we'll talk with other people who affect all of our cities, and that we're doing it tonight. Now, I'm very happy tonight to welcome Dr. David Schultz from Hamline University. And a few months back, he put on a program called the Minnesota Community Assemblies in Brooklyn Park.
Correct.
And we're going to learn about that, but it's mainly involved in helping citizens to be more active and positive in their communications.
To help not just citizens, but residents of communities. Right. Correct.
So we'll learn about that and hopefully spread the word so more cities get involved.
Yes.
And I let him know ahead of time that I'm going to let you just briefly introduce yourself out to our wider audience, kind of
Sure.
who you are and how you're connected with all of it.
Okay, good. My name is David Schultz. I'm a professor of political science at Hamline University, as well as a law professor at the University of Minnesota. And throughout my entire teaching career, I have been very, very interested in the issues of community engagement and helping to improve the quality of government decision making.
Right.
And approximately about November of 2015, I received a call from the Joyce Foundation, which is one of the big foundations operating in the Midwest, and they approached me about whether or not I would be interested in doing something that at that point was named the Community, or rather the Citizens Assembly Project. That what it was that in British Columbia, provincial-wide, Ontario, provincial-wide, the idea was to get together a fairly large number of residents for about a year, and they would deliberate about the structure of government, learn a lot about government, and then come up with some recommendations regarding what they would like to see in terms of the future of their provincial government. When the Joyce Foundation approached me, instead they said, what we'd like to do is something at the local level to see if you'd be interested in running these assemblies at the local level, not for a year long, but a much shorter period of time. And to also see if you could engage residents in those communities in terms of talking about some of the common issues that they share, and eventually coming up with, as I described it, coming up with their suggestions regarding, or the residents would come up with suggestions regarding what they would like the future of their local government to look like and what role they would have in it.
Right.
So they invited me to put together a grant. Eventually, I put together a grant that was funded by the Joyce Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, a grant totaling approximately $500,000 to do a series of 3, and eventually we'll talk about it, 4 assemblies across the state of Minnesota. Brooklyn Park was the 3rd of our 4th assemblies that we did, and we did those in November and December of 2017.
Yeah, since it's in our area, we thought if we bring your information to our wider audience, they can kind of encourage their cities to get involved in that if it sounds something that they'd like to follow through on.
And we hope so. I mean, in doing the 3 assemblies, the goal was to learn something from these assemblies that could be applied to other cities across Minnesota, across the rest of the country. So in many ways, Brooklyn Park, along with Red Wing, Minnesota, along with Wilmer, Minnesota, and then eventually Maplewood, we're sort of describing as role models. Role models for the rest of the state and perhaps for the rest of the country.
Now, and I looked at the website, I looked at some of the information you had. How actively were the cities involved that you selected in the setup or the finding people or?
Well, there's sort of a couple of questions there, but first off, the city selection was something that I came up with in terms of it, and we can come back and talk about it in a second here. But one of the things that we were sort of straddling is that on the one hand, we clearly would like to have had cities involved to be engaged, But on the other hand, we didn't want these to be viewed as city-directed
Right,
projects,
right.
because they're not.
Right.
We wanted these to be community assemblies, which means it is the residents of the communities and not the city that's directing them. Now, luckily, in all the communities that we did our assemblies, the local governments seemed receptive or interested in what we
Right.
were doing. Brooklyn Park, especially so, was very excited by it. But at the end of the day, the goal was not to make this something that was officially
Right.
the program of the city of Brooklyn Park or Red Wing or Wilmer or Maplewood, but perhaps something that might be useful to those cities, but something that would be independent. Because again, we also didn't want anybody to think that the cities were exercising a heavy hand, especially if when the residents who were participating in these assemblies might be critical regarding what the cities were doing. We wanted them to feel free to think and come up with their own recommendations.
And then I thought I'd just have you mention or maybe give some examples of how does this idea of teaching people, getting them involved in active participation benefit the cities?
Well, one of the things that we're also trying to achieve with this is a story that I like to say is that at a time when nationally we are heavily polarized and we can't seem to get anything done at the federal level.
Right.
At the state level, it's also happening, unfortunately, in St. Paul and across the country. Local government is like the last place where it seems that people can have a voice and make a difference. Local government is the place where what? It's about where the streets are paved, the potholes are filled, the fire departments, put out the fires, the police arrest the bad guys. It's about the quality of life. It's about the core things that matter most to people in terms of what they're doing and what affects their life. And so what we wanted to be able to achieve is to get people engaged at the local level, for them to be able to feel that they have a voice at a time or in circumstances where we can get them to see beyond the partisan fights, the partisan disputes. One of the things that we also know is that for most people, government's confusing.
Oh, yes.
People, and I know when I used to work in local government, people would call me, I'd be in local government, and they would say to me, well, my grandmother didn't get her Social Security check. And I would say, okay, I'm sorry, but that's the federal government.
Yeah.
Or somebody would call me about some other problem. I'd say, that's a state issue. Many people, I think, are a little confused. Many people oftentimes don't understand what local government does. And I think that creates some of the frustration, some of the anger that we see in our society. So part of the assumption of the assemblies was to say, well, if we put together a group of people representative of a community like Brooklyn Park, provided them with some education, some training, created the appropriate structure where they could talk, what would they come up with in terms of, again, their ideas about what they would like their local government to look like, what they would like it to do, and again, what role they would have. And that really is what the assembly is about. It's about providing education and training. And with that, what we're hoping is that at the conclusion of these assemblies, we have educated 15, 20, 30, 40 new people who will become maybe the next generation of leaders or become much more actively engaged in their community than they've been in the past.
Yeah, because there's people want to be involved, but they're not sure how, and they're not sure if they should even try. So something that encourages them and gives them some skills to go with.
Some skills and some tools. And you're right. And I think for some people it's also intimidating.
Yeah.
For some people, I would say, especially for many of our newest residents in Brooklyn Park or across Minnesota, the idea of going to City Hall, the idea of perhaps of contacting an elected official might be scary, it might be foreign, it might be kind of intimidating. And breaking down some of those barriers, giving people some knowledge about what some of the access points are, who to contact, or what you need to do to do certain things, I think is tremendously important in terms of what we're also trying to do.
Oh, I think it's very important. And always encouraging people to do that in this area. And it's started under this grant, but will the Minnesota Community Assemblies continue to go forward after the grant?
Well, we hope so. Again,
Okay.
we got a grant initially to do 3 assemblies.
Okay,
when
right.
we got the 2 grants, the 2 grantors, the 2 foundations thought, well, maybe you'll be able to do 2 with that. Well, we wound up doing 3. We have a little extra money to do a 4th one. As I mentioned before, we're hoping that the 4 serve as role models for other communities. We're going to take all the materials from all 4 cities, leave them on what we hope is a permanent website. We're going to be adding more information over the next few months in terms of our final reports, our recommendations, things that we thought that worked and didn't work, with the hope that other communities that might be interested in what we did might be able to learn from what we did and do it in their own communities.
And the people out there from our 9 communities, or 8, because Brooklyn Park's already done it,
Right.
could be the stimulus to get their city involved.
It could very well be. That's what we're hoping.
Yeah.
We're hoping that the word of mouth, shows like this, for example, people will watch it and say, hey, that was a pretty nifty thing you guys did. We are seeing how it's encouraging more people to get involved or becoming a better informed bunch of residents. We'd like to do the same thing in our community.
And when you got the 3 cities, then from reading stuff, I think you tried to make the number of people match the, what's the word I want?
The demographics.
The demographics of
Yes,
the
correct,
city, right.
correct. And what we tried to do when we selected these 3 cities, well, first off, let me explain how we selected the cities.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to ask that after I did.
Yeah, and again, our 3 primary cities were Red Wing,
Okay.
Wilmer, and Brooklyn Park. In order to get to those cities, we first took all the cities in the state of Minnesota, which is a pretty large number, about 700 to 800, and we first wanted to look at cities that were home rule charter cities. And why we wanted to do that is that we were hoping that by them being home rule charter, these would be cities that if the residents came up with recommendations, the city could adopt their own recommendations without having to go to the states.
Right.
And then of those, that narrowed it down to about, I would say, about 100 cities or so. We then looked at what would be initiative and referendum cities. Cities that could actually, the residents themselves could actually push things through if they wanted. That got us down to about 87. And then we used some other criteria. We looked at cities that we wanted to have represent racially, politically, geographically, different parts of the state. We wanted cities that had a lot of changes going on. In some cases, cities that had faced some we'll just say, challenges in terms of governance. By the time we filtered that, all came down to our primary 3 cities of Red Wing, Wilmer, and Brooklyn Park. The reason why I like those 3 cities is that in many ways they also represent 3 different faces of Minnesota and 3 different faces of our country. Think about it. Red Wing is a city that's still probably about 90 to 95% white. It is politically quite cohesive. In many ways, it looks like traditional Minnesota. Wilmer is a city that is in central western Minnesota that is changing in all kinds of ways. 30 years ago, it was mostly white Caucasian. The biggest ethnic differences out there would have been German versus Scandinavian or Lutheran versus Catholic. But first, about 25 years ago, a large Hispanic or Latino population moved in. And then in the last few years, an East African population. So it's changing. That's kind of the face of America now. And then Brooklyn Park is really the face of America tomorrow. It's the face of Minnesota tomorrow. It is near a majority of the population are people of color. A very large percentage are immigrant from outside the United States. And it represents, again, where the United States is turning to increasingly. And what we wanted to do is pick those kind of visions of 3 different visions of Minnesota in order to say, can we run assemblies across those 3 communities and see what we would come up with. In terms of then what we would want to do for each city, we obviously couldn't have all the people in all the cities participate. We decided that the best way to do it was to come up with a way that we could match the populations of the assemblies by gender, by race, partisanship, education, and a few other variables.
So what you were looking at is something that replicated the community.
What we were looking for was a way to try to match what each city's assembly participants would look like as close as a match of the city overall. So we got the most recent census data, worked from that to try to create a map, a picture, again, by race, by income, by age, by party, so that we could say these people are almost like a mini jury, a mini representation of their community.
And then there was a process where people could volunteer to do this, and then you picked out the groups that matched the demographics.
Exactly. What we did was initially to mail out postcards to a lot of households telling people about the assembly. But Miriam, my assistant, and I also knew that sometimes the way to reach people is to find those barbershops, those stores, those churches or temples or other places which are community centers, to talk to leaders and to tell them about this as a way of also trying to do what? To trying to recruit. So we did that. We also took out some ads in some newspapers for different groups, and putting it all together was our way of trying to reach out to try to really get the sample that we wanted to have.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that some of the cities struggle with is how to get people involved.
No, this is the challenge. I mean, the other thing that we really made as a mandate for ourselves was to say that we know that every city hall has the squeaky wheels, has the people who always show up, the people who are always there. What we wanted to be able to do is to reach the non-traditional voices, those people who don't always show up, who don't feel comfortable, who might not know very much, who might feel intimidated. So our goal was to reach those people and to get beyond the people who are already engaged. We still cared about them, but what we really wanted to do was to reach to a new generation of people with the hope that we could also get them active in the political process, to educate them, to train them, that they would become the new leaders of their community and the new leaders who would, for example, in Brooklyn Park perhaps down the line.
Yeah, because people need something to give them the confidence to move forward,
They do. And one of the things that we know, and I know this as a professor, when I talk to my students, my 18, 19, 20-year-old students, a lot of times they say to me, one of the reasons why they don't get involved is because they don't feel like they have enough information. They feel like they're just not sure what's going on. And I think for a lot of people, feel the same way also.
I think so.
They may have never walked into City Hall. They may not know what a mayor is, or what a city council member is, what a city manager is. Providing residents of communities, and I'm going to explain why we use the word residents. Providing information to residents is critical because that knowledge makes them feel more confident about getting involved, and it gives them, again, the tools, the ability to actually engage.
Then some of these same techniques cities could use.
Well, that's what we're hoping, because think about, and I talk about this in a different context. Back east where I'm from originally, I used to work in local government, And like many local governments around here, we had to put together things like comprehensive plans.
Right.
We needed to do projects to try to get people more involved in the communities, to provide input to the local
Right.
government. And one of the things that every community struggles with in doing say, for example, a comp plan.
Right.
How do we reach those people who are traditionally not involved? How do we communicate with those people who might be too busy, unaware, et cetera, et cetera? So part of what we're hoping to have learned from this, are there some techniques
Right.
that Brooklyn Park, that Maple Grove, that Brooklyn Center, that New Hope, that all the communities
Right.
that are here and across Minnesota and across
right.
the country, can they learn anything from what we did
Yeah.
as perhaps a blueprint, as a map for
Right.
how to get others involved in their community?
Yeah, I think that's an important underlying part.
I do too.
Then, what was the outward structure? How much time did people have to give to this, and how was that carried out?
This was a very strong, big commitment here.
Yeah.
This was a total of 8 days. So we did it over a course of 3 weekends. So it was a 2-day weekend, a 3-day weekend, and then another 3-day weekend, asking people to do a lot.
Right, right.
But what's important to know here, though, is that we compensated people.
Yeah, I thought that was good.
Yeah. One of the things is we can't ask people to give up
Right.
that amount of time. Otherwise, there may be people who are working or doing other things, they can't afford it. So we paid people $100 a day. I think it was $100, about $100,
Right.
$100 a day to be involved in the assemblies. Plus, we covered reasonable travel and child care expenses. We also fed people, and we put a big emphasis upon using restaurants and vendors that were within the community
right.
so that we could give back to those businesses. And over those 8 days, it was pretty intense, because what we were doing in those 8 days is first working with people to teach them how to talk to one another, how to actually work together, which is a challenge.
Right.
And
right.
then with that, to establish what are the most important goals, values that they have for their local government, provide them with some understanding of what national versus state versus local government does, what their local government does in Brooklyn Park, and then eventually, what are some of the possible reforms? What are some of the different ideas? Because if the whole idea was for people to say, here are the values that are important to us, what type of governmental structures,
right.
what
Right.
type of electoral structures, what type of political process would best achieve the values that we would like to secure in terms of our local government. Had to put that together,
Right.
and then finally it culminated in them making a presentation to the mayor and a couple of the council members in Brooklyn Park.
Right.
So this is a very, very intense education, communications, deliberations process.
Oh, yeah, I could see that. And that gives people confidence too, then, that they're working in a milieu that they know something about now, because you've taken the time to do some teaching.
It is correct, yes. And we wanted to create also a safe environment when we did this. And what I mean by a safe environment is, again, I think part of the problem with American politics right now, I think it can be summed up in a really simple phrase. A lot of American politics now is all about the "you're stupid, I'm offended." And what I mean by that is that we want to call the other side stupid. And if they disagree with us or they criticize us, we want to say "I'm offended." And that's not how you engage in political debate and political discussion. So we wanted to create a safe environment where people from a variety of backgrounds, variety of bodies of knowledge or levels of knowledge could actually talk about local government, and then eventually come up with the recommendations that they would like to see.
And then one of the things you stressed was how you define good governance.
Yeah.
And maybe we could talk a little bit about that before our time runs out.
Yeah, well, governance is a pretty broad term. Again, we
Yes.
wanted to look at, for example, the structure of government. Is it strong mayor, weak mayor? We also wanted to look at, in terms of elections, how council member districts are drawn, what kind of election system is used. But then we also, as part of governance, also wanted to look at perhaps simply the structure of City Hall, in terms of what positions there are.
Oh, sure.
Collectively, all those things together would be part of the governance issue, along with, again, defining what role residents have in the community. And so when we talk about good governance, we're looking at that, but in relationship to the basic, as we talked about before, the basic values that people have in terms of what they like to see in local government. Because one of the things that I won't do is a cookie cutter. One of the things I didn't want to do is to say what we came up in the process that we used in Wilmer versus Red Wing versus Brooklyn Park. We didn't expect to get the same results, the same answers, the same recommendations. Each community is unique. Each community has its own values, its own priorities. And we wanted participants in each of those communities to define those values that they think constitute good governance.
And it's like a long-term, into the future thing.
We hope so.
Yeah.
We hope it will, again, define the values and the structure that people would like to see in their local government. I'm not sure if I'm willing to say for the next 20 years, but let's say for at least the next dozen years or something like that.
But then any of the other 8 cities in our community could get involved in the same kind of process. They could contact their city councils, but if people are wanting to put something like this together, then they could contact the Minnesota Community
They can
Assembly.
contact Community Assembly or contact me. I mean, my email, my phone number is available. I know it'll be posted here.
We put it up.
But yes, they will. They're encouraged to contact the assemblies. Go to our website. Contact me. We can talk a little bit about what we did, what we accomplished, maybe some recommendations for the future. I'm also hoping that not just residents, in the Northwest, but maybe public officials who are watching this might say, well, this is a great way of getting my residents more involved. Can we not learn something from this process? Can I contact Professor Schultz or the Assemblies Project and talk and learn something about what you did? Yeah, I more than encourage that.
Yeah, because like I said, that's what we try to encourage people to do. And when I heard about your program, I thought, well, that's the steps people can go through to make it really happen.
They can. And I'm not quite willing to say we're providing the blueprint or the toolkit, but we certainly have come up with some avenues, some ideas that might be useful to try to get people more involved.
Well, I want to thank you so much.
Of course.
And we'll encourage all of you out there to tune in next week for the second part of the Minnesota Community Assemblies. And then if any of the areas we talked about stimulated an interest with you, then contact David Schultz.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.